Paul was reminding me that in the Jewish Bible, in the scriptures, the scrolls, that the book of Ruth follows the Psalms, Proverbs 31, to talk about and be consistent with the idea of Ruth and her character. But in our collection of books that we call our Bible, it's right after Judges, and the reason is it's chronological. Actually, some would say Samuel was accountable for the writing of Ruth, but that's not to be debated, really, I think. But what you'll find is the time of the Judges. The book of Judges ends with, at this time, the last verse, at this time there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And Ruth begins with a very similar sentence. Now, you have to remember at the time of the Judges, there was a lot of national strife, a lot of looking over your shoulder, and there's a lot of talk in Judges about battles and struggles with other nations and that type of thing. And so there's this constant international conflict type of thing going on. And it's interesting to see that as we leave that book and come into Ruth, that we see that God is not only paying attention to these national struggles with leadership, but He's also got attention to a family by name. And so when you start thinking that God doesn't connect with me or doesn't know me, you have to remember this. He left Judges, and now He's relating to us a story about a family, right? And not just a family, but some ladies in the family. We were talking about this Wednesday night where basically women at this time, they would have no voice. Children had no voice, better seen, not heard, and women had no voice. But here in this book, we're focused on the path of these women, right? And God is going to try to accomplish something, right, because He can, in the life of Ruth the Moabitess, that puts her in the lineage of Jesus Christ, this Gentile girl. And He is, in His providence, arranging this entire thing, right? And He's got to, by the way, He's got to get Ruth out of Moab. And so this is helpful to me when I'm consuming the book of Ruth. It's good for us to remember. He's got to get Ruth out of Moab in a state where she's in Bethlehem so that she can meet Boaz and basically come into a marriage relationship with Boaz. How's that all going to occur? God's going to make that happen by various means. Also, I watched this show a long time ago called The Red Tent. I don't know if anybody ever seen The Red Tent? No? Mm-hmm. Google it. Take a look. It's an interesting series, right? It's a short series, but it's all about nomadic people and how it is they travel. And the red tent is where the women were, right? So in the guys' tent, they're watching football and skinning animals, and in the women would go like, "They're gross, that stinks in there." I think, and then they would go hang out in the red tent. And actually, I thought today what I should have called this is the red tent. Because the red tent, what happened in there was, guess what? Discipleship. So they learned to cook and how to care and how to sew and all the various things and gossip, all the things that women do when they're in the tent together, right? Because that's where they're comfortable. But what happens in that tent that we'll see today is discipleship happened in that tent. There was something Ruth saw in Naomi, in her life, in her testimony, that drew her towards faith in God, Yahweh. And so that's what's actually the most important thing today, is to see that amidst the trouble that we're about to see in the life of Naomi, her faith did not fail. Her faith was steadfast in that God had His hand in her life continually, whether the times were good or the times were bad. And so that's what we're going to look at today. That's kind of the theme of today, is to remember that God's provision will always be there, and God's love for us, even though the story looks horrible. And I want you to try to put yourself in Naomi's shoes. The story is not very hopeful, right? But she never loses track of who God is to her, and that it's personal. So that's where we're headed today. Let's start out with Ruth and chapter 1 and verse 1. Let's pray. Father, thank You for Your word. We ask this day that what is heard by our ears is not my voice but yours, that the teaching is a teaching that comes from you and has the life-changing power that you have promised us. We ask your blessing on this time and your word in Christ and for his glory. Ruth chapter 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah. And they went to Moab and they lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women. One was Orpah, the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years. Both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husbands. Can you imagine, by the way, being in a foreign land and losing your husband, and you're like, well, at least I have my sons. And then they get married, and there's joy associated with that, because guess what? There's promise, and there's nothing more promising if you're Naomi than the idea of, I might have some grandbabies. Grandbabies. Make them happen, right? Bring joy to me. And then those 2 boys who she's raised and loved, whom they left Bethlehem to feed. By the way, have you ever thought about what it would be like to be in a land of famine and watch your kids and tuck your kids into bed at night and say this to them? I promise tomorrow we will eat. But Mama, because their stomachs are growling and it's hard to fall asleep when you're that hungry, right? I promise tomorrow we'll get something. So they leave. They go to a land where they could eat. The kids get married. The boys die. Well, here's an interesting thing. I was thinking about this too the other day. So if you transplanted our families to that time, basically what you have to do is you have to think this way. So let's say, because I have a brother, right, and he got married, and something happens to him. His wife now becomes my wife, right? And I take her into my family, and she becomes my wife. But by the way, that's why we all should be very interested in who it is that our siblings are getting connected with, right? Because what God's saying is there is some accountability in this area. But then again, if anything happened to me, Charlotte would then become Brett's, and I'm pretty sure she would probably have strangled him by now. But then again, if she strangles him, she'll have a bed and 3 hots, right? And free clothing for a long time. Now, the thing is, if either of these, by the way, why am I bringing this up? If either of her sons had survived, Ruth would have become the wife of the brother, right? Which was not possible. In God's providence, this would not have been possible. All I'm going to say to you is this. In order for God's providence to occur and for Ruth to end up in Bethlehem, the father had to die and the boys had to die. Basically, in God's plan, this tragedy was scheduled for them in the land of Moab. And Naomi had no idea. Elimelech would have never left if he had known what was going to be occurring in Moab. Pretty simple, right? So this thing is working its way out, and God's providence is being worked out. And it's interesting for us to see, by the way, and I wrote this down for you, but in the Bethlehem means house of bread. And so here you are, you go famine in a place that's called the house of bread. There's no bread in the house of bread. And by the end of this book, what you'll see, of this chapter, what you'll see is they're back in Bethlehem, and what is it? It's first fruits harvest. God has restored this within this chapter, and basically he said, okay, stop playing the bagpipes, it's time to bring out the banjos, right? So there's this hopelessness to a time of great hope, of full bellies and sustaining life. It's also interesting in the Old Testament, anytime you're studying the Old Testament, take a look at this. It's just a good theme to be reminded of, and I'm not going to dwell on it, but anytime you travel east, you're traveling away from God. And whenever you're traveling west, you're traveling towards God. And it's this Edenic picture, right, of this eastern gate. If you travel away from the eastern gate, you're going the way of Cain. If you travel towards Eden, you would have to enter it coming in from the west. And so there's this idea of going away from God and then coming back or returning to God that's built into the story for us, the picture for us. So let's move on now. We now have Naomi in the red tent, and many things have been occurring, right, in this 10 years, right? And what we're about to see is decisions that have to be made. Now, I'm leaving out verses 11 through 13, but really it's the same debate. Naomi is trying to say, look, there's no hope with me. If you try to follow along with me, there's no hope in this plan. Right, and so here's what's happening at this point. She is trying to convince these girls, Orpah and Ruth, to go back to their families. She's going to try to convince them. And so and what will happen is a decision will be made by both of them, and the decisions are greatly different. Both ladies, Orpah and Ruth, exposed to the same things in the red tent. And both making choices that are obtuse to one another. Verse 6, when Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. They're traveling. They're headed up the east coast of the Dead Sea to go across the Jordan and back into Bethlehem. They're on the road. When Naomi said to her daughters-in-law, go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness. She's trying to bless these girls on their way out. May the Lord grant you, each of you, your kindness, as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband. Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, we will go back with you to your people. At this, they wept aloud again. Of course, she had again described, by the way, can you picture women weeping together at all? Loudly? Can you imagine? Yeah. Is it a realizable picture? And so here it is again. She's basically said to them, by the time I get married and have sons, are you going to wait around 20 years to marry those boys? Because that would be their only option if she hung around with Naomi. And basically she's trying to convince them again. And she said this, and then they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, and Ruth clung to her. Look, said Naomi, your sister-in-law is going back to what? Her people and her gods. Your sister-in-law, Orpah, is going back to her people and to her God. The familiar is where she's headed. I'm going to go back and try to reestablish my life in the land of the familiar. But Ruth replied, because she said to her, she's going back to her people and her gods. And Naomi, one last time, says, go back with her. Don't let her travel alone. Go back with her to your people and your gods. Now, strikingly, this particular set of text that I have bolded on the page for you, this is Ruth's testimony of faith. This is her faith statement, right? And that's why it's significant. Where you go, I will go. She told her mother-in-law, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. I'm tired of this conversation. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people. Your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you from me. This is what she is swearing. She's making an oath to her mother-in-law. And it's important because in chapters ahead we'll see that Boaz greatly respects what it is that she has done, and it has an infinite impact on the decisions that he's about to make. That we'll see in next chapter. When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped nagging her. She stopped urging her. She says, okay, well, here we go. And they continue on their way. So I think it's important for us to just know that both of these young ladies were exposed to the same thing. And yet one of them, at the urging of the mother-in-law, said, you're right. I'm going to go back to the things that are familiar. And so sometimes we get to when trials are coming and things are getting hard, sometimes we say, this path that God has me, I do not like it. And people are talking me out of it. I think I'm going to listen to them. And so Orpah made a choice, and she basically turned around and she returned not only to the people that she was with, but to the gods, it says, to the gods. Yes, Paul?
So, I don't know if you're going to get to this, and I hope I'm not stealing your thunder, but their names are listed as Orpah and Ruth. So Orpah was probably the most senior, and therefore she would have also had first rights to Boaz.
Interesting. She had to escape the picture.
Yeah.
Interesting. Also, notice when I was reading ahead that Naomi, of course, has kind of a center place in the first chapter, but later on, what you'll start to see is she basically says Ruth's mother-in-law. So she kind of gets like, kicked to the side in the next few chapters. But here we have Ruth making a confession of her faith. And she's like, your God is my God. Your people, my people. This is a picture of a Gentile being adopted into God's family. And her commitment to that adoption. When Naomi realized that she was determined, she stopped. She stopped urging her. And so I think it's important to see that the activities in the red tent were critical to creating an environment and the character of a young lady named Ruth. And so I don't know what your red tent is, but probably what you would see is in your life, it could be any number of things. It could be the clinic. It could be a volleyball team. It could be your basketball team. It could be wherever you find yourself. That's your red tent. Right? It's a place of discipleship where people are learning what it means to believe in God by watching and listening to you. Because that's the only thing Ruth knew about God, is whatever she picked up from Naomi. So it's an important thing. Where's your red tent? And what are you teaching in that place? So, verse 19. So, the two women, Naomi and Ruth, went on until they came to Bethlehem. Now, the important thing about this piece of the text is for us to realize that it's Naomi's perseverance in the situation. Given all the hard things that have happened in her life and how hope has been ripped from her life, the things that she would have looked forward to as an old woman, right, completely taken away and ripped from her. Yet her faith in God remains. Right, her faith that God is interacting in her life, knows her personally, and has a plan for her. She never stops believing that thing, and she's hanging to that thing. So the two women went on until they had come to Bethlehem. And when they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred up because of them, and the women exclaimed, can that be Naomi? Right? They saw the two ladies walking into town, haven't seen them in what? 10 or 15 years. Right? And so here's the group of women, again, different tent, group of women, and they're all there, and they're watching Naomi come down, and they're like, is that, it looks like Naomi. And another one says, yes, but she's put on so much weight, I'm not. And the other one is, but Naomi would never wear anything that looks like that. And so they're blah, 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 blah about this, and like, nope, that's her. I'm pretty sure that's her. That's her. And so they cry out. They cry out to her to see if you ever done this where you're not sure if somebody is the person you remember, and you say their name and see if they turn around, right? Naomi! And Naomi turns because that's who she is. And that's when they realize, yep, that fat chick, that's her. That's her. Right? So, because she was in a place where she could eat, the rest of them, they just, been on a famine. So, anyway, she says, could this be Naomi? And Naomi's response, Naomi walks over to them. And by the way, I wrote this down. Did I write it down for you? Yes. Naomi, her name means delightful. Right? Like, by the way, the bride in the scripture, always beautiful. Right? And you'll see this over and over again. There was something, I believe, about Naomi that would have attracted you to her. And same thing with Ruth. There was something about Ruth that would have attracted you to her in appearance. And so Naomi's name means delightful. But she says, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara. Mara, you guys remember the word? Right? You remember the story about the waters in the wilderness, right? And they called the place Mara. Why? Because the waters were bitter, right? And so she's saying to these women, don't call me Naomi, she said, call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. And when she does that, by the way, what she's acknowledging is, He didn't leave me, He's touched me intimately. He is involved in my life in so many ways. Her confession is, I trust the Lord. I do not like the way I'm treated. My life is so bitter, but I know that it is His providence, His hand in my life that's made it this way. And so she's accepting of it. And what she's demonstrating is a faith that doesn't fail when things get hard. I went away full, but the Lord brought me back empty. Why call me delightful? Don't call me that. The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. So she left a place of famine, went to a land of plenty, and experienced famine in a far place. And now she returns. And verse 22 says to us, she returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem, what? As the barley harvest was beginning. So we left in a famine. She returns at a time of the first fruits, not just any harvest, but the harvest of the first fruits. And the house of bread has bread again. It's a fascinating picture for us to get our hands around. Ruth, by the way, during this testimony, where is Ruth? Well, she's standing beside Naomi. Nobody knows Ruth, right? She's a foreigner. And the other ladies that greeted Naomi, they don't know who this is. But Ruth gets to witness Naomi's testimony of her faith in front of these people that knew Naomi before she left town, right? Because it is it's a small village, and she would have known. So the thing to pick up here and make sure that we don't miss is this idea of the faith of this lady and how it was a testament. This lady Naomi, that was a testimony to Ruth, and how it is that she witnessed to Ruth just in her life and in her words, even though she confessed, my life is difficult. God has dealt difficultly with me. But it never gives up on the idea that God has His hand on her life. And that I think is what I was hoping we would take away from this, and that is this idea of your testimony, regardless of your path, whether it's been an easy street or a difficult one, that whatever it is that our testimony is, I will never forget that God's love is with me and His provision is there for me, whether times are good or times are hard. Because if we're not in a storm today, there's a storm coming, or we've come through a storm. And that's what I wanted to make sure I share with you today before we get any further. So, in Ruth. Does anybody have anything they'd like to contribute?
I was just thinking, if I heard somebody say, my life is just really bitter and miserable right now, we interpret that as complaining, and I guess it's really important that we do follow it up with God's still in control of
God
this,
has,
because
yeah.
someone who's not a Christian hears you say that, they're not going to understand, well, where's your faith if you're complaining about
It's a really good point. Really good point. So this idea here, and so what are Naomi's words? And let's make sure we understand her words. She basically is saying, don't call me delightful, call me bitter, because God has dealt bitterly with me. Right? It's a different affirmation than just complaining. She's not complaining. She understands God has dealt with her this way. Whatever pain she's experiencing, whether it's emotional, spiritual, physical, whatever it is, we have to think similarly. I'm not sure why, but in a fallen world, we should expect the same thing, right? And know that regardless of where it is we find ourselves, we have to remember that God loves you still, that God's provision will be there for you. And oh, by the way, we don't know. You know, I was talking to a lady this week who's been through the fire, right, and doesn't understand any of this thing, but her faith in God is steadfast. And I said to her, I said, suppose that your purpose on the planet was to birth this child who would become the grandmother of the next Billy Graham. You have no idea. You have no idea. And I said, but this is Ruth. So if you're Ruth, by the way, you are going to, right, what's it called when you give away the story before, like if you've seen a show before somebody else? Spoiler alert! Spoiler alert! Ruth is going to marry Boaz. The two of them are going to give birth to, are going to have a child named Obed. Obed is the father of Jesse. Jesse's the father of David. Right? So Ruth is King David's great grandmother. Right? Great grandmother. Wow, that's pretty cool. Ruth is David's great grandmother. Now, did Naomi have any clue? That she probably went to her grave never knowing that. Right? So what's important? Whether our times are good or our times are hard, whether we're in pain, physically, mentally, spiritually, whatever. God has put us in the place He's put us for a particular reason, and we're supposed to grow through it and give Him thanks. Because we don't see the big picture, He does. Right? We don't understand it, but we're supposed to trust Him that He knows what's best. Anybody else? Good point, Sandy.
I don't know if this is, I'd have to glean this again, but I don't know other than this right here, the author never refers to her as Mara.
What's that?
He doesn't refer to her as Mara.
He never, no.
He continues to say Naomi.
She refers to herself that way.
Right.
The author doesn't, but like I said, within the chapter, she's going to kind of get kicked to the side after her motherly advice to Ruth, which we'll see next week. She becomes a side character, but it's all the way. By the way, it's always in the future chapters. Ruth's faithfulness to Naomi wins the day. Her testimony, your God, my God. Your people, my people. That testimony for Ruth will win the day.
I wish as a teenager that, and even when we go to Kentucky, that's the one thing I want these kids to understand, that their life right now may just be hell, and they may be in a really bad circumstance, but we don't have that hindsight as a teenager, or we don't have that foresight to know that God can take all that and use it for something later on the road. You're experiencing what you're experiencing for a reason.
Yeah, there was a lady here yesterday packing shoe boxes, and she was telling me how she desperately wants her children to go to Kentucky so that her children can see the plight of children that don't have it so nice. And I told her, I said, well, it's life-changing. They will not come back the same. But whether we have plenty or not, we should always remember that God has His hand, knows you personally, just like He has left this international conflict and now is intimate with the members of this family. He sees your family the same, and we don't understand or see the big picture. We're called to trust in Him. Let's pray. Father, thank you for this day together. Thank you for your word. It is a precious gift that you reveal yourself to us through it. We thank you for the weeks ahead in Ruth, that we may come to know your Son more clearly through it, that it might be a life-changing time for us. Change us in the ways that only you can. That's good in Christ's name.